giant African rat at the San Diego Zoo is showing off her sense of smell and improving the reputation of her fellow rats along the way.
That's right. Runa, this is Runa, a Gambian pouched rat, is an ambassador for other...
Imagine walking out to your porch on a humid Florida night, flashlight in hand, expecting to see a stray cat or maybe a raccoon rummaging through the trash. Instead, the beam hits something that defies logic. A rat the size of a small dog, nearly 3 feet long, staring back with intelligent, unblinking eyes. This isn't a horror movie or a local urban legend. This was the terrifying reality for residents of Grassy Key.
Of course, everyone who meets her thinks, what a cute 3-pound rat. I mean, she's bigger than the normal rat. She's showing her intelligence. She has personality, and a lot of wildlife does that. Good job.
When a biological time bomb officially went off. Rat on the loose. How exactly does a giant rodent from the African savanna end up chilling in the Florida Keys? It sounds like the start of a bad joke, but the reality is actually a bit of a cautionary tale about the exotic pet trade. Back in the late 90s, specifically around 1999, there was a licensed exotic pet breeder living on Grassy Key. Now, Grassy Key isn't exactly a bustling metropolis. It's a relatively quiet stretch of land in the Middle Keys, known more for dolphin research centers than international biological scares. This breeder had a handful of Gambian giant pouched rats, 8 of them, to be exact. At the time, these animals were a bit of a niche cool pet. People liked them because they're incredibly smart. They can be tamed if handled from a young age, and, let's be honest, there's a certain shock value to walking a rat the size of a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel on a leash. But these aren't your average feeder rats from the local pet store. The Gambian giant pouched rat, or Chrysotomys gambianus, is a biological masterpiece of survival. In their native sub-Saharan Africa, they've evolved to handle everything from predators to harsh climates. They aren't actually true rats in the way we think of the ones in New York City. They belong to a different family of muroid rodents, and they get that pouched name from the massive cheek pouches they use to carry seeds and nuts, sort of like a hamster on absolute steroids. Anyway, back to the breeder. The story goes that these 8 rats managed to slip out of their enclosure. Now, whether it was a cage left ajar or a structural failure, the result was the same. 8 highly intelligent, highly adaptable, and very fertile rodents were suddenly loose in the Florida mangroves. To a human, 8 rats might seem like a small number, something you could catch in a weekend with some cheese and a couple of traps. But to a biologist, 8 rats is a nightmare. In the world of invasive species, that's what we call a propagule pressure event. You have to understand the physical stats of what just hit the Florida woods. These rats can grow up to 3 feet long from nose to the tip of their tail and can weigh nearly 9 pounds. Imagine a house cat, but with the chewing power of a bolt cutter. Their teeth are massive, and they have this incredible climbing ability. In the Florida Keys, which is essentially a chain of islands filled with dense tropical hardwood hammocks and mangroves, these rats found themselves in a literal paradise. There was plenty of food, almost no natural predators large enough to take them down once they hit full size, and a climate that felt just like home. The most shocking part for the experts wasn't just that they escaped, it was how perfectly suited they were for the environment. These rats are nocturnal, meaning they stayed hidden during the day while the people of Grassy Key went about their business. While the breeder might have hoped they'd just wander off and die, the rats were doing the exact opposite. They were scouting territory, finding water sources, and most importantly, they were starting to find each other. In the wild, a female can have multiple litters a year, with up to 5 pups per litter. If you do the math, those original 8 escapees weren't just a localized problem, they were the founding fathers of an empire that was about to wake up the entire Florida Department of Environmental Protection. It didn't take long for 8 rats to become a full-blown occupation. Thriving founding fathers. By the time 2004 rolled around, the situation on Grassy Key had shifted from an oops moment to a full-blown ecological occupation. Those original 8 escapees hadn't just survived, they had thrived in a way that truly caught wildlife officials off guard. In the world of biology, we often talk about the rule of tens, the idea that only 10% of introduced species survive, and only 10% of those actually become a pest. These rats took those odds and absolutely smashed them. Within just 5 years, those 8 original founding fathers had multiplied into a population estimated to be in the hundreds. Locals started reporting sightings of giant cat-sized shadows darting across the overseas highway or scurrying under their porches with a speed that didn't match their massive size. At first, many people dismissed it as typical Florida weirdness. This is a state where people see iguanas falling out of trees and gators in their swimming pools after all. But when the reports started coming in, with consistent descriptions of long, scaly, white-tipped tails and pouches stuffed so full of stolen birdseed that the rats looked like they had the mumps, the authorities realized this wasn't an urban legend. The explosion wasn't just in numbers, but in the sheer territory they were beginning to claim. The problem with an invasive species like the Gambian rat is that they don't just sit still. They occupy every available niche. Because they are omnivores, they were eating everything in sight. They were raiding local gardens, clearing out bird feeders, and, more worryingly, preying on native snails and insects. In a place like the Florida Keys, where the ecosystem is incredibly fragile and full of endangered species found nowhere else on Earth, a 9-pound rodent is basically a Godzilla-level threat to the local food chain. Imagine being a native Florida Key wood rat, an animal that is already struggling to survive, and suddenly this 3-foot-long cousin from overseas moves in, steals your food, takes over your burrow, and probably bullies you out of your own neighborhood. The United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, FWC, were suddenly in a state of high alert. They weren't just worried about a few missing mangoes from someone's backyard. The real fear was geographic. If these rats managed to hop a ride in the back of a truck, crawl into a shipping container, or even swim across the narrow channels between islands, they could reach the Florida mainland. If the Gambian rat reached the Everglades, or the massive agricultural hubs of Homestead and Miami-Dade, the damage would be measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We're talking about an animal that can chew through electrical wiring, destroy entire crops of tropical fruits, and outcompete every native rodent in the state. Biologists were genuinely shocked at how quickly the rats had adapted to the unique limestone terrain of the Keys. They weren't just living in the bushes, they were using the natural crevices and solution holes in the rock to create deep, protected burrows that were nearly impossible for traditional predators like hawks or owls to reach. They were also incredibly clever. Some residents reported that the rats seemed to learn their schedules, waiting for them to leave before raiding the trash, or coming out to eat the pet food left on the porch. It was a perfect storm of biological luck and human negligence. The shocking reality was that while the state was busy fighting the early stages of the Burmese python invasion, a second, fuzzier front had opened up right under their noses. The clock was ticking, and the USDA realized that if they didn't act immediately, they would lose the keys to a species that was literally eating its way through the neighborhood. What really kept the experts up at night, though, was the math. When you have an animal that hits sexual maturity in just a few months and can have up to 4 or 5 litters a year, the population curve isn't just a slope, it's a vertical line. If they had hit 1,000 rats, the sheer momentum of their breeding would have made them almost impossible to stop. This was a race against biology itself, and the stakes were getting higher every single day the rats remained on the loose. It wasn't just about their size, though. It was about what they were carrying. The monkeypox scare. While the idea of a giant rat is scary enough on its own, the situation took a much darker turn when health officials realized that these animals weren't just a threat to the local flora and fauna. They were a legitimate threat to human life. In 2003, right as the Florida population was hitting its stride, a bizarre medical mystery began unfolding in the American Midwest. People in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Indiana were showing up to hospitals with fever, respiratory issues, and strange, painful, pox-like lesions. This was the first time monkeypox had ever been recorded in the Western Hemisphere, and the source of the outbreak was eventually traced back to a shipment of exotic animals from from Ghana that landed in Texas. Inside that shipment were several species of African rodents, including our infamous Gambian giant pouched rats. They had been housed in close proximity to prairie dogs, which were being sold as pets. The rats passed the virus to the prairie dogs, and the prairie dogs passed it to their owners. While the Florida population hadn't been directly linked to that specific 2003 outbreak, the event sent a massive shockwave through the CDC and the USDA. Suddenly, the rats on Grassy Key weren't just escaped pets or invasive pests, they were potential mobile biological hazards. The fear was that if a single wild rat in the Keys caught a local virus or carried a dormant African strain, they could act as a reservoir, keeping the disease alive and spreading it to humans or other local wildlife. This health scare was the final straw for the federal government. It led to an immediate, permanent ban on the importation of all African rodents into the United States. In Florida, this turned the eradication effort from a localized conservation project into a high-priority public health mission. Experts were terrified of the what-if scenarios. If these rats reached the mainland and integrated with the massive populations of common roof rats in Miami or Fort Lauderdale, tracking a potential outbreak would be an absolute nightmare. The Gambian rats' social nature and habit of nesting in communal burrows made them the perfect environment for a virus to circulate and mutate. The monkeypox connection changed the public's perception too. People who previously thought the giant rats were cute or just a part of Florida's quirkiness suddenly wanted them gone yesterday. Every sneeze or rash in the Keys was suddenly looked at with suspicion. The USDA had to move fast to reassure the public while simultaneously figuring out how to handle an animal that could potentially bite a child or a pet and transmit a life-altering disease. The stakes had officially jumped from protecting the environment to protecting the population, and the war on the giant rat was about to get a whole lot more aggressive. With the clock ticking, Florida launched one of the most unique wars in its history, Operation Rat Trap. With the threat of disease and ecological collapse looming, the USDA Wildlife Services didn't just show up with some standard mousetraps and a chunk of cheddar. They launched a full-scale tactical assault. This wasn't like catching a nuisance raccoon in your attic. We are talking about a multi-year systematic campaign that involved some of the most creative and, frankly, weird wildlife engineering ever seen in the Florida Keys. The goal was simple but incredibly difficult. Kill every single Gambian giant pouched rat on Grassy Key without accidentally wiping out the local wildlife that actually belonged there. The biggest challenge the experts faced was the collateral damage factor. The Florida Keys are home to several endangered species, most notably the Key Largo wood rat and the Key deer. If the USDA just spread generic rat poison all over the islands, they would end up killing the very animals they were trying to protect. To solve this, they developed a piece of tech that looked like something out of a DIY hardware store video: the boot-shaped bait station. These were custom-built PVC pipe structures shaped like a capital letter L or a boot. The design was ingenious. Because Gambian rats are so long and flexible, they could crawl through the pipe to reach the bait at the far end. However, the curve of the boot prevented shorter, sturdier animals like the protected Key Florida wood rat or local raccoons from reaching the poison. It was a physical filter designed specifically for the giant rat's unique anatomy. They didn't just stop at clever pipes, though. They turned the eradication into a data-driven operation. They laid out a massive grid across the island, placing over 1,000 of these stations in a dense pattern. Biologists spent years trekking through the thick, mosquito-infested mangroves, checking these stations, refilling bait, and looking for signs of activity. They used high-tech infrared cameras, which were a lot more expensive and rare back then, to track the rats' movements at night. This allowed them to see exactly how the rats were interacting with the traps. They learned that the rats were incredibly cautious. They wouldn't just run into a new object. They had to be pre-baited with non-toxic food for weeks until they felt safe, and only then would the lethal bait be introduced. The bait itself was a potent anticoagulant, but the logistics of the war were what really exhausted the teams. Imagine doing this in the Florida heat, humidity at 90%, surrounded by spiders and swamp water, all to find a rodent that is actively trying to avoid you. It was a game of cat and mouse, except the mouse was the size of a cat, and the cat was a group of sweaty federal agents with clipboards and GPS units. They even used Judas rats, captured rats that were fitted with radio collars and released back into the wild. The idea was that the rat would lead the scientists back to the secret communal burrows, allowing them to take out the entire colony at once. By 2008, the team had removed hundreds of rats. The sightings dropped from daily occurrences to nothing. The traps were coming back empty week after week. The USDA began to feel a sense of cautious optimism. They had spent millions of dollars and countless man-hours on this tiny stretch of land, and it seemed like the giant rat war was finally coming to a close. They were looking for any sign of a survivor. One track, one dropping, one blurry camera image, and finding nothing. In the world of invasive species management, this is the golden hour, that moment where you think you've actually done the impossible and won. Just when the experts thought they had won, the terrifying twist happened. The ghost population. In 2009, the federal government did something it almost never gets to do in the war against invasive species. They declared victory. After 2 years of empty traps and zero sightings, the USDA officially announced that the Gambian giant pouched rat had been eradicated from the Florida Keys. It was a massive PR win, a gold standard for how coordinated science and aggressive trapping could protect an ecosystem. The agents packed up their gear, the boot-shaped traps were pulled from the mangroves, and the budget was reallocated to the next crisis. For a moment, Grassy Key was quiet, but biology doesn't follow a press release. The silence lasted until 2011. It started with a single phone call from a resident who claimed they had seen a cat-sized rat scurrying through their garden. At first, officials were skeptical. They assumed it was a case of mistaken identity, perhaps a large marsh rabbit or an oversized common roof rat. But then another call came, and another. Photos began to surface on social media, grainy, midnight snapshots of that unmistakable, long, white-tipped tail. The ghosts of Grassy Key had returned, and they hadn't come from offshore. They had been there the whole time. The realization was a gut punch to the scientific community. How could a 9-pound rodent vanish for years, only to reappear in the exact same neighborhood? The answer lies in the terrifying intelligence of Chrysetomys gambianus. These rats didn't just survive the eradication, they outsmarted it. Experts believe a small, founder remnant of the population had learned to avoid the bait stations entirely. Whether it was a localized aversion to the smell of the PVC pipes or a shift in diet toward the abundant natural snails and fruits of the hammock, a few genius rats had stayed off the grid long enough for the humans to give up and go home. This is the ghost population phenomenon. In a dense mangrove forest, you don't need 1,000 survivors to restart an empire, you only need 2. These survivors were the elite, the ones most wary of human scent, the ones best at hiding in the deep limestone solution holes where even infrared cameras couldn't peer. Once the pressure of the trapping program was removed, these elite survivors did what they do best. They multiplied. Because the USDA had cleared out the dumber competition during the first phase of the war, the new generation was composed entirely of the offspring of the most cautious, trap-shy rats. In an accidental twist of Darwinism, the government had effectively bred a super rat that was even harder to catch than the original escapees. By 2012, the FWC was forced to relaunch the mission. This time, however, the mood was different. The optimism of 2008 was replaced by a grim understanding of the enemy. They realized they weren't just fighting a pest, they were fighting an evolutionary specialist. The reappearance of the rats proved that 0 is a very hard number to reach in the Florida bush. It sparked a heated debate among biologists. Is it actually possible to kill a species this smart? Or are we just trimming the hedges of a population that will always find a way to endure? The twist wasn't just that the rats were back. It was the realization that as long as there is a single crevice in the limestone and a single piece of fruit on a tree, the giant rat of Grassy Key might never truly be gone. But to understand why these rats are so hard to beat, we have to look at where they came from. The African origin. To truly understand why a few escapees could baffle the United States government, you have to look at the crucible where they were forged. Chrysetomys gambianus isn't a product of the city sewers or the dark corners of a subway. It is a creature of the sub-Saharan African savanna, a vast and unforgiving landscape where everything is trying to eat you, and water can vanish for months. This is not just a big rat, it is a specialized survival engine that has been refined over millions of years to thrive in the face of absolute adversity. In their native range, which stretches from central to southern Africa, these rodents occupy a massive variety of habitats, from dense forests to arid grasslands. This environmental flexibility is the primary reason they looked at the Florida Keys and didn't see a foreign land. They saw a vacation home. While a common brown rat is a generalist scavenger, the Gambian giant pouched rat is an ecological polymath. They have evolved a metabolism that allows them to store massive amounts of energy in the form of body fat, and those signature cheek pouches are more than just grocery bags. They are a strategic advantage. A single rat can transport several hundred grams of food in one trip, allowing it to spend less time exposed to predators and more time in the safety of its fortress-like burrow. Speaking of burrows, their engineering skills are legendary. In the African soil, these rats dig complex, multi-chambered tunnel systems that can reach over 20 feet in length. These aren't just holes in the dirt, they are climate-controlled bunkers with specific rooms for sleeping, hoarding food, and even waste disposal. This deep-seated instinct to dig and disappear is exactly what allowed them to exploit the limestone solution holes in the Florida Keys. In Africa, these burrows protect them from the scorching heat and predators like snakes and birds of prey. In Florida, those same instincts protected them from the USDA's thermal cameras and poison teams. They also possess a sensory array that puts most other mammals to shame. Because they are nocturnal and live in dense cover, their eyesight is poor, but they have compensated with a sense of smell so acute it borders on the supernatural. They can detect chemical signatures in the soil and air that are completely invisible to humans. This hyper-developed olfactory system is what made them so trap-shy in the Keys. They weren't just seeing the traps, they were smelling the human who touched them, the metallic tang of the cage, and the synthetic chemicals in the bait from dozens of yards away. They didn't survive in Florida by being lucky. They survived because they are the descendants of the ultimate African survivalists. Surprisingly, the same traits that make them a nightmare in Florida make them heroes elsewhere. The hero rat paradox. The very traits that make Chrysetomys gambianus an invasive nightmare in the Florida Keys, their incredible sense of smell, their high intelligence, and their relentless work ethic, have been harnessed across the Atlantic to save thousands of human lives. This is the story of Apopo, a Belgian non-governmental organization that realized these monsters were actually untapped geniuses. In a project that sounds like science fiction, researchers began training Gambian giant pouched rats to detect landmines. They dubbed them hero rats, and they have since become the front line of humanitarian demining in countries like Mozambique, Angola, and Cambodia. The biology that allowed these rats to sniff out a boot-shaped trap in the Florida mangroves is the exact same biology that allows them to detect the scent of TNT buried deep underground. While a human with a metal detector is slow and prone to error, and an armored vehicle is expensive, a hero rat is a masterpiece of efficiency. They are too light to trigger the mines, weighing only a few pounds, so they can scurry directly over a deadly explosive without any risk to themselves. When they catch the scent of a mine, they don't dig it up. They simply scratch at the surface, alerting their handlers, and then move on to the next one in exchange for a piece of banana or a nut. The most famous of these rodents was a rat named Magawa. Over the course of his 5-year career in Cambodia, Magawa cleared over 2.4 million square feet of land, discovering 71 landmines and dozens of items of unexploded ordnance. He became the first rat to ever receive the PDSA Gold Medal, the animal equivalent of the George Cross, for his life-saving bravery. One rat, a species currently being hunted by the USDA in Florida, was single-handedly responsible for returning entire villages to safety, allowing farmers to plow their fields again without the fear of losing a limb or a child. This creates a fascinating ethical and ecological paradox. How can the same animal be a public enemy in one hemisphere and a decorated hero in another? It forces us to look at the term invasive species not as a biological trait, but as a matter of geography. In the African savanna or the Cambodian fields, their intelligence is a gift to humanity. In the fragile hardwood hammocks of the Florida Keys, that same intelligence is a weapon that threatens to unbalance an entire ecosystem. Using invasive species for good is a complex moral gray area. If the Gambian rat is so capable, why not use them more broadly? The answer always circles back to the Florida lesson. We cannot control what we do not fully understand. The Hero Rat program works because it is a strictly controlled, laboratory-to-field environment. The Florida crisis happened because we underestimated the rat's capacity to thrive outside of our control. It's a reminder that a misunderstood genius is only a hero as long as they aren't destroying your backyard. Is it possible that the monster in the Florida Keys was just a misunderstood genius? The Florida pattern. The story of the Gambian giant pouched rat isn't an isolated incident. It is a single chapter in a much larger, more chaotic book. Florida is world-renowned for its sun and sand, but in the scientific community, it is known as a literal petri dish for invasive species. From the Burmese pythons strangling the Everglades to the prehistoric-looking iguanas falling out of trees during cold snaps, the state is under a constant biological siege. But why Florida? And how do the rats fit into this larger, dangerous pattern? The answer lies in a perfect storm of geography, commerce, and climate. Florida acts as a massive subtropical funnel. It is one of the primary entry points for the international wildlife trade, with ports in Miami and Tampa handling millions of exotic animals every year. When you combine a high volume of imported species with a climate that mimics the tropical and sub-Saharan regions of the globe, you get an environment where escape almost always leads to establishment. In the frozen winters of the north, a stray Gambian rat would perish in days. In the Florida Keys, it just finds a mango tree and starts a family. The Gambian rat follows the Florida pattern of invasion to a T. First, there is the lag phase, where the animal exists in small, unnoticed numbers, much like those initial 8 escapees on Grassy Key. Then comes the explosion, where the population hits a critical mass and the public finally takes notice. By the time the authorities respond, the animal has usually already integrated into the local ecology. The rats, like the pythons before them, exploited a specific empty niche. Florida's native rodents are generally small and vulnerable. There was no large, intelligent, omnivorous mammal to keep the Gambian rats in check. This pattern reveals an uncomfortable truth about our relationship with nature. We are often the ones providing the ladder for the invasion. The pet trade fueled the demand, the breeder provided the opportunity, and the Florida landscape provided the resources. The rats didn't invade Florida. They were invited. And once they arrived, they realized the doors were never really locked. If you want to keep track of the next monster to invade the Sunshine State, make sure to hit subscribe and stay tuned for more.